You are allowed to feel joy. 100 affirmations. You are allowed to enjoy your life. You are allowed to feel good without earning it. You are allowed to experience happiness freely. You are allowed to smile without explanation. You are allowed to feel light even after heaviness. You are allowed to enjoy moments of ease. You are allowed to feel pleasure without punishment. You're allowed to feel joy even if others are struggling. You're allowed to let happiness land. You're allowed to feel joy without fixing anyone else first. You are allowed to feel joy without apologizing. You are allowed to feel joy without minimizing it. You're allowed to feel joy without preparing for loss. You're allowed to feel joy without bracing for consequences. You're allowed to laugh freely. You're allowed to feel delight in the small things in life. You're allowed to feel warmth in your body. You're allowed to feel joy and peace when it arrives. You're allowed to feel joy without being done healing. You're allowed to feel joy alongside grief. You're allowed to feel joy alongside responsibility. You're allowed to feel joy alongside growth. You're allowed to feel joy in imperfect circumstances. You're allowed to enjoy what you've built. You're allowed to enjoy rest. You're allowed to enjoy pleasure without vigilance. You're allowed to enjoy life without waiting for permission. You're allowed to enjoy moments as they are. You're allowed to feel joy without being disloyal to the past. You're allowed to feel joy without abandoning your values. You're allowed to feel joy without losing depth. You're allowed to feel joy without losing empathy. You are allowed to let joy soften you. You're allowed to let joy expand you. You're allowed to let joy restore you. You're allowed to let joy nourish you. You're allowed to let joy be simple. You are allowed to feel joy without rushing to deserve it. You're allowed to feel joy without questioning it. You are allowed to feel joy without explaining why. You are allowed to feel joy without measuring it. You are allowed to feel joy without fear of being judged. You are allowed to enjoy being alive. You are allowed to enjoy your body. You are allowed to enjoy your senses. You're allowed to enjoy your creativity. You're allowed to enjoy your presence. You're allowed to feel joy even when life is complex. You're allowed to feel joy even when things aren't finished. You're allowed to feel joy even when others don't understand. You're allowed to feel joy even when it surprises you. You're allowed to feel joy even when it feels unfamiliar. You are allowed to trust joy when it arrives. You are allowed to stay with joy instead of shrinking it. You are allowed to receive joy fully. You are allowed to let joy settle in your body. You're allowed to feel joy without leaving yourself. You're allowed to feel joy without managing other people's feelings. You're allowed to feel joy without caretaking. You are allowed to feel joy without dimming it. You are allowed to feel joy without hiding it. You're allowed to feel joy without guilt for those who cannot. You're allowed to choose joy when it feels true. You're allowed to prioritize what brings you joy. You're allowed to protect your joy. You're allowed to cultivate joy. You are allowed to feel joy without waiting for the right time. You're allowed to feel joy now. You are allowed to feel joy in this season. You are allowed to feel joy in your own time and in your own way. You are allowed to feel joy on your own terms. You're allowed to feel joy without fear of losing control. You're allowed to feel joy without anticipating collapse. You're allowed to feel joy without staying on edge. You're allowed to feel joy without scanning for what's next. You're allowed to feel joy without bracing. You are allowed to let joy coexist with responsibility. You're allowed to let joy coexist with maturity. You're allowed to let joy coexist with wisdom. You are allowed to let joy coexist with boundaries. You're allowed to let joy coexist with self-respect. You are allowed to feel joy as a sign of safety. You are allowed to feel joy as a sign of healing. You're allowed to feel joy as a sign of presence. You're allowed to feel joy as a natural state. You're allowed to feel joy without guilt, fully and honestly. You are allowed to feel joy without shame. You are allowed to feel joy without conditions. You're allowed to feel joy and stay grounded. You're allowed to feel joy and stay whole. You're allowed to feel joy and stay connected to yourself. You're allowed to feel joy and trusted. You are allowed to feel joy without guilt, and you're safe to let it stay.